That was Paul Adams there. Well, joining us now from Washington is Joshua Cohen. He's a former State Department official and now a columnist for the Moscow Times. Mr. Cohen, give us your assessment. Where do you think we are now in this conflict?
Well, I think at this point, as your correspondent said, there's certainly, ironically enough, the possibility that the truce is more likely to take hold. It was very clear, even during the negotiations, that the two sides disagreed on the status of Debaltseve, and that the rebels were very explicit in saying that they did not consider Debaltseve to be part of the truce agreement. So it's entirely possible that, having consolidated their lines and taken Debaltseve, which is a key rail junction connecting the two provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, that at this point the ceasefire could take. But it's very, very unpredictable. I mean, after this upsurge in violence, we can't be sure what will happen. I mean, so much of it is going to depend on the next few days, and both how the Ukrainians react and how the rebels react.
And I suppose part of it is, and this has been a fear right from the start of these negotiations, with Angela Merkel and François Hollande playing a leading role, that you have two sides which have very different ideas of how the future of Ukraine should look, and they are not exhausted by the fighting. In other words, this could go on for a very long time.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. There are two very, very different ideas, and you've also got outside parties, obviously primarily Russia, with their own view on how it should go. One of the key points in the Minsk II agreement is that the Ukrainians are essentially being asked to decentralize a large amount of power to the separatist-held regions, everything from police and taxing power to even economic power and the ability to form independent economic relationships. So while the rebels and Putin look at this as what they're calling the federalization of Ukraine, Poroshenko is looking at it as more of a decentralization, which isn't going to, in theory, is not going to inhibit Ukraine's turn to the West, whereas Putin is obviously very, very determined to prevent Ukraine from joining both the EU and NATO, and I believe looks at this, at the separatist-controlled regions, looks at the Donbass as a lever to prevent Ukraine from ever turning to the West.
That's a very interesting point, because let me just get you to explain that a bit more. If you have, in effect, a frozen conflict, so even if you have a ceasefire, but you have an area which is in dispute, a country which is not entirely in control of its own borders, it's impossible to see how that would be able to join NATO or the EU. So a frozen conflict would be in Vladimir Putin's interest, wouldn't it?
That's absolutely correct. There's really sort of two possibilities in terms of how, assuming something along those lines plays out. One is that there is some kind of permanent settlement, that the Ukrainians enact the kind of reforms, and we really are talking constitutional reforms that would need to go through the Rada and be approved, which essentially, at the end of the day, will give the separatists, I believe that is what Putin is looking for, a veto over which direction Ukraine goes. And at that point, Ukraine, in theory, regains control of its borders, and there's some type of permanent settlement. That's supposed to happen by the end of the year. The reality is a lot could go wrong between now and then, and we may very well end up with simply another frozen conflict of the same type that we've seen in Abkhazia, that we've seen in South Ossetia, and that we've seen in Transnistria, which used to be part of Moldova. So I think either one of those outcomes would certainly fulfill Putin's desires of keeping Ukraine from turning to the West. I think if he had to choose, it would be some type of formal settlement that leaves Ukraine de jure intact, but essentially gives the separatist regions a veto over Ukraine's future. And I think the reason he would choose that is because once there's a permanent settlement, that would make it more likely for Western sanctions to be lifted. But either way, they're very close, whether it's an ongoing frozen conflict or whether it's a formal settlement. Either way, Putin's objective is to prevent Ukraine from moving to the West and from joining Western institutions.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us, Mr. Cohen.